She had packed everything she owned into one trunk and a canvas bag, and the man who was supposed to meet her at the station had been dead for 6 days before she even boarded the train. She didn't know that yet. She found out standing on a platform in Bozeman, Montana, in November, with the wind cutting through her coat like it had somewhere more important to be, holding a letter from a man named Douglas Fenn, who had written her 3 months ago asking if she would come west and teach his children, and maybe, if things went well, consider becoming his wife. She had written back. They had exchanged 4 more letters. She had given notice at the school in Cincinnati. She had sold her mother's writing desk because she needed the money for the ticket. The man who met her was not Douglas Fenn. He was taller than she expected, though she hadn't expected anyone at all, and he held his hat in his hands the way men do when they're about to say something they don't want to say. "Miss Aldrin?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. "Douglas Fenn passed 6 days ago. Fever." He paused. "I'm sorry. I know that's not what you were hoping to hear." She stood very still. The wind kept going. The platform was otherwise empty. "I'm his brother," the man added. "Colt." He stopped himself. Silas Fenn. "I came because there was no one else to come." She looked at him for a long moment. She had not come all this way because she loved Douglas Fenn. She had never met Douglas Fenn. She had come because she was 26 years old, and teaching other people's children in a city that had started to feel like a room she couldn't get out of. And his letter had used the word home 4 times in the first paragraph, and she had been so tired of not having one. "Is there a hotel in town?" she asked. Silas Fenn looked at her with something that was not quite pity and not quite respect, but lived somewhere in the narrow space between them. "There is," he said, "but it's not much, and it's cold. I've been cold before." He nodded slowly. He put his hat back on. "I'll take your trunk." The hotel was $3 a night and smelled like wood smoke and damp wool, which was not the worst thing she had ever smelled, but close. She lay on top of the blanket in her coat because she didn't want to find out what was underneath it, and she stared at the ceiling and tried to think clearly. Her name was Emmeline Aldrin, and she was practical. That was what her mother had always said. Emmy is the practical one. What her mother meant was that Emmy did not cry easily, did not panic in a crisis, did not indulge in what her mother called carrying on. What her mother did not know was that being practical was not the same as not feeling things. It just meant you felt them quietly, in hotel rooms in Montana, at 11 o'clock at night, when there was no one around to watch. She was not in love with Douglas Fenn. She had not expected to be, not yet. She had expected something slower, a getting to know, a gradual building of something that might someday become love, if we're patient and lucky, and both willing. She had not expected to arrive and find nothing at all. She thought about the money she had spent on the ticket. She thought about her mother's writing desk, which was gone now and could not be unsold. She thought about the school in Cincinnati, which had already hired someone else because she had given 2 months' notice and been very thorough about it, because that was what practical people did. She fell asleep somewhere around midnight, still in her coat. Silas Fenn came back the next morning at 7, which she knew because she was already awake, sitting at the small table by the window with the last of her bread from the train wrapped in paper, watching the street below start to fill with people. "I want to offer you something," he said when she let him in. He stood near the door and kept his hat in his hands again. "It might not be the right offer. You can say no." "Go ahead," she said. Douglas had 2 children. Eliza is 9. Theo is 6. He was looking at the window, not at her. "They've been staying with our neighbor, Mrs. Canby, since their father passed, but that was always meant to be temporary. They need to come home, and someone needs to be at the house with them while I'm working the land." He paused. "I'm not asking you to marry me. I want to be clear about that. I'm asking if you'd be willing to stay on as, I don't know what you'd call it, a housekeeper, a teacher, someone who's there." Emmeline looked at him. He was still not looking at her. "What does the house look like?" she asked. He blinked. That was apparently not the question he had expected. "It's a ranch house," he said. 3 bedrooms. One of them was Douglas's. You'd have it. The children are in the back 2 rooms. Is it warm? There's a stove. I keep it stocked. Do the children know I'm here? No, he said. I didn't know what to tell them. She thought about this for a moment. She thought about Eliza, who was 9, and had lost her father 6 days ago, and Theo, who was 6, and probably didn't fully understand yet what losing meant. "All right," she said. Silas Fenn finally looked at her. "I'll pay you," he said quickly. "Properly. Whatever Douglas was going to pay. I know, she said. That's not why I said yes. She didn't tell him why she had actually said yes, because she wasn't sure she could explain it. This feeling that the children needed someone, and she was already here, and sometimes life arranged itself into a shape that asked you to step into it without giving you time to deliberate. She finished her bread. She went to pack her trunk. The ranch was 12 miles out of town, and the road there was frozen mud that made the wagon rock and lurch the whole way. Silas Fenn drove. He didn't talk much. She didn't push him. She noticed things about him the way she noticed things about everyone. Carefully, without making it obvious. He drove with his shoulders forward, like he was bracing for something. His hands on the reins were steady. He had a small scar near his left jaw that was old enough to have gone silver. He said hum when he was thinking, and he was thinking often. She looked out at the land instead. Montana in November was enormous in a way that felt personal, like it was looking back at her. The mountains were already white at the top. The sky was the color of a tin cup. It gets more snow than Cincinnati, Silas said, when they were about halfway there. I assumed, she replied. Just thought you should know. I appreciate it. Another long silence. Then he said, You're not what I expected. What did you expect? He thought about that. Someone more. He stopped. More what? More scared, he said finally. She turned to look at him. He was watching the road. I am scared, she said. I'm just not going to let it stop me. He said, and she turned back to the mountains. The children were waiting on the porch when the wagon came up the road, which meant Mrs. Canby had told them someone was coming even if she hadn't said who. Eliza stood with her arms crossed and her chin up, wearing an expression Emmeline recognized immediately, because she had worn it herself at 9. That particular combination of suspicion and hope that you assembled on your face to protect yourself from being disappointed again. Theo stood slightly behind his sister with one hand holding the hem of her coat. Silas climbed down first and then offered his hand to help Emmeline down, which she took because the step was icy and not because she needed the help. This is Miss Aldrin, Silas said. She's going to be staying with you for a while. Eliza looked at her very seriously. Are you going to be our new mother? She asked. Eliza, Silas said quietly. No, Emmeline said, before he could add anything more. She crouched down so she was level with both children. I'm going to be someone who lives here with you and makes sure you get to school and has dinner ready when your uncle comes in from the fields. That's what I'm going to be. Is that all right with you both? Theo looked at her from behind Eliza's coat. Do you know how to make biscuits? He asked. I do, she said. Our papa made the best biscuits, he said. His voice was very matter-of-fact about it. I believe you, she said. Mine probably aren't as good, but I'll try. Theo thought about this with the gravity of a 6-year-old weighing something important. Then he nodded. Eliza uncrossed her arms, just slightly. Silas Fenn, standing a few feet behind Emmeline, was very quiet in the way people are quiet, when they are trying not to show that something has caught them off guard. The first 2 weeks were not easy. She had not expected them to be. Eliza tested her in small ways, forgetting to come in when called, asking questions that were designed to be impossible to answer correctly, refusing to eat carrots on principle. Emmeline did not fight any of it. She answered the impossible questions as honestly as she could, left the carrots off Eliza's plate without comment, called a second time, and then went to the door to knock if a second call didn't work. She had been teaching long enough to know that children who tested you were not being difficult. They were asking a question their mouths didn't know how to form. The question was always some version of, "Are you going to leave?" She did not say, "I'm not going anywhere," because that was a promise she couldn't fully keep. She said, "I'm here today every morning," which was a smaller promise and an honest one. And after 10 days, Eliza started coming in when called the first time. Theo was easier, and in some ways harder. He wanted to tell her everything, about the horses, about a hole in the fence near the east pasture that he'd discovered in September, about a dream he'd had where a bear came to school and sat at his decks, and nobody thought that was strange. She listened to all of it. She wrote down the most interesting parts in a small notebook she kept in her apron pocket, and when he asked why she was writing, she said it was because she thought his dreams were worth remembering. He didn't say anything to that. But the next morning, he came and stood next to her while she made coffee and told her about another dream. A better one this time, while she wrote it down. Silas worked from before sunrise until after dark. She would hear him come in and move through the kitchen while she was already in bed. trying to remember what quiet felt like in Cincinnati, which had never been this quiet. He ate whatever she left warming on the stove and didn't say much about it. But after the third night she came out in the morning to find the wood box beside the stove had been restocked without her asking, and after the fourth night there was a rabbit on the kitchen table, already dressed, with a note that said, "If you know what to do with this." She did know what to do with it. She made a stew. He came in that evening, and she heard him stop in the kitchen and then start eating, and neither of them mentioned it, and that was fine. It was the cold that started things, or rather, the specific cold of the night in late November, when the temperature dropped so far that the pipes froze, and she woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of Theo crying in the room down the hall. She went to him. He had kicked his blankets off the bed in his sleep, and the room was freezing. She pulled the blankets back up around him and sat with him until the crying stopped, which wasn't long. He was half asleep and didn't know what was wrong, except that something was wrong, and her being there was enough to settle him. She was on her way back to her own room when she almost walked directly into Silas Fenn in the hallway. He had clearly also heard Theo and come from the other end of the house. He was holding a lamp. She was holding nothing. They both stood very still for a moment. "He's fine," she said quietly. "Just cold." I pulled his blankets up. Silas looked past her toward the closed door. Then he looked at her. In the lamplight his face was different than it was in the daytime, less guarded, or maybe just harder to guard when you'd clearly been asleep. "Thank you," he said. His voice was low enough not to wake the children. "It's what I'm here for," she said. He looked at her for another moment, and she had the distinct sense that he wanted to say something else, and decided not to. "Go back to sleep," she said, which was perhaps too familiar, and she was already moving past him back toward her room before she could hear whether he responded. But in the morning she found that someone had added an extra blanket to both children's beds, folded at the foot, and a third one had been placed outside her door. He hadn't knocked, he had simply left it there. She stood in the doorway looking at it for a long moment. She picked it up. She went inside. December arrived with a snowstorm that kept them all in the house for 3 straight days, which was its own kind of trial. Eliza ran out of patience for staying indoors on the second afternoon and started teaching Theo a card game that didn't have any real rules and kept changing its rules to suit her, which made Theo furious. Emmeline sat at the kitchen table, grading the schoolwork she had been assigning them both, and pretended not to hear the argument developing in the next room until it reached a volume she could no longer professionally ignore. She had not expected Silas to be there. He had been out checking the fence line before the storm hit, and she had assumed he would stay in the barn until it passed, the way she understood men did, because the barn was close to the house and she had seen him go in that direction. But he appeared in the doorway of the front room just as she did, coming from opposite sides, and they both stopped. He looked at the children. Eliza had Theo by the wrist and was explaining something loudly and incorrectly. Theo was trying to bite her hand. "Eliza," Silas said. Both children stopped immediately. Emmeline noted this with professional interest. "What do you say we build something?" Silas said. It was not a question. "Build what?" Eliza demanded, releasing Theo's wrist. "I don't know yet," he said. "Get the big box out of the back room." He spent the next 2 hours on the floor of the front room with a box of salvaged wood scraps and a set of tools, building Theo an elaborate corral for the wooden horses he kept on his windowsill, while Eliza supervised with the intense editorial focus of someone who had very specific opinions about fence posts. Emmeline stood in the doorway and watched, and tried to figure out what she was feeling. It was something she hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe something she had never felt quite like this. It was the specific feeling of watching a person be quietly, competently good at something without any audience, and without performing it for anyone. And it lodged in her chest in a way that was inconvenient and probably ill-timed. She went back to the kitchen. She made dinner. She called them all when it was ready. Silas came in and washed his hands and sat at the far end of the table, and she sat at the near end, and the children sat in between them and talked about the corral for the entire meal, and she and Silas did not talk to each other at all, which was fine, except that it was also not fine. She had a system after a while. She knew things about Silas Fenn without having been told them directly. She knew he didn't eat breakfast unless she left something for him, and if she left something, he ate it standing by the window before going out. She knew he was particularly careful about Douglas's room. She had heard him stop outside the closed door twice, and twice she had heard him walk away again without opening it. She knew he had not made any changes to the house since Douglas died, and that this was not because he was lazy but because he was trying to give the children time that he himself probably needed too. She knew that he fixed things. The step that had been uneven when she arrived was even now. The window in Theo's room that let in a draft had been resealed. The kitchen door latch that had to be lifted just so had been adjusted so it caught properly. None of these things had been announced. She had simply noticed them the way she noticed everything, carefully, and after the fact. She started leaving a cup of coffee on the kitchen table every morning before she woke the children. It wasn't a statement, it was just coffee. But she timed it so it would still be warm when he came in, which required knowing roughly when he came in, which meant she had been paying attention, which she did not fully examine. One morning in January he came in while she was still in the kitchen, which was unusual. She was at the counter making Eliza's lunch. He stopped when he saw her, the way he always stopped when he encountered her somewhere unexpected, and then he crossed to the table and picked up the coffee. "Thank you," he said. "It's always there," she said, which was unnecessary and too much, but he didn't say anything more about it. He stood by the table and drank his coffee, and she continued making the lunch, and the silence was the particular kind of silence that is not actually empty. "You're good with them," he said eventually. She kept her eyes on the bread she was slicing. "They're good kids, they are," he said. "They weren't always easy before." Douglas had a hard time after their mother left. She hadn't known the children's mother left. She had assumed the mother had died. She kept very still and let him continue. 4 years ago, he said. She just wasn't suited to it. The isolation. He paused. "I don't blame her. It's a hard life out here if it's not what you want." She set down the bread knife. "And if it is what you want?" He looked up at her. "Then it's something else," he said. She didn't ask what. She picked up the bread knife. They were quiet again. But when he left, he paused at the kitchen door. The fixed one that latched properly now, and he said without turning around, "The coffee helps." "I mean it. I know you mean it," she said. She heard the door close. She stood very still for a moment, with the bread knife in her hand and the white January light coming through the kitchen window, and something in her chest rearranged itself quietly, like furniture being moved in a room, and she let it. There was one evening in late February that she thought about for a long time afterward. The children were in bed. The storm from the week before had passed, and the sky was extraordinarily clear in the way Montana skies got clear after a storm, like the world had been scrubbed. Emmeline had gone out to the porch because the kitchen was warm, and she needed a minute that wasn't warm, and she was standing there looking at the stars, which were unreasonable out here, excessive, too many and too bright, like someone had been showing off. She heard the door behind her. Silas came out and stood beside her, which surprised her because he had been in the barn late, and she had assumed he would go straight to sleep. He didn't say anything. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the same sky. After a while he said, "Douglas and I used to come out here when we were kids. Our father built this porch because he said the inside of a house was no place to think." "He sounds like he understood something," she said. "He understood most things." He was quiet again. Then, "Douglas liked you, you know, from your letters." She hadn't expected that. "He said you wrote like someone who knew how to mean what they said," Silas continued. "He showed me all 4 of your letters." She looked at him. He was still looking at the sky. "He would have been good to you," he said. "I want you to know that. Whatever you were hoping for when you came out here, he would have tried." Something in her chest went tight and then, unexpectedly, went loose. "I know," she said. "I believe that about him from his letters, too." Silas nodded. He was quiet for long enough that the stars moved a fraction of a degree, and she noticed that, the way she noticed things. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Are you going to spend the rest of your life being careful with me?" He turned to look at her then. She could see him working something out behind his eyes. "I don't know what you mean," he said. "I think you do," she said. He was quiet. "I'm not made of glass," she said. "I'm also not a problem you inherited along with the children and the ranch. I know that's how this started, but it's not what this is now, and I think you know that too." He looked at her for a very long time. "Emmeline," he said. It was the first time he had used her name, her whole name, like he had been saving it. "Yes," she said. "I don't know what to do with this," he said. "I want you to know that's the truth." "I'm not," I don't have a lot of practice with this. I know, she said. I don't either. I don't want to get it wrong. Then we'll get it wrong together, she said. And fix it the same way you fix the fence and the latches and the step. Something shifted in his face. It was not a smile exactly. It was something that lived behind a smile, the thing that makes a smile possible. That's a strange way to talk about this, he said. I'm a practical person, she said. He looked at her. Then, very slowly, he reached out and took her hand. Not the way you take someone's hand when you're helping them off a wagon. The other way. He held it carefully. The way you hold something you're not sure is yours to hold yet. She let him. They stood on the porch of the house that his brother had built and looked at the unreasonable Montana sky for a long time, not saying anything, because there was nothing that needed saying yet. And she had learned by now that Silas Fenn understood the difference between a silence that needed filling and a silence that needed keeping. Spring came in April, which seemed late to her, but turned out to be early for Montana. Eliza informed her of this with the authority of a native, and Emmeline took notes in her small notebook, and Eliza saw her doing it and stopped mid-sentence. "Are you writing down what I said?" Eliza asked. "Yes," Emmeline replied. "Why? Because you know things I don't," she said, "and I like knowing things." Eliza considered this for a moment with great seriousness. Then she sat down across from Emmeline at the kitchen table and folded her hands. "I can tell you more things," she said, "if you want." "I want," Emmeline said. She turned to a new page. Theo came in from outside with his boots still on, which was one of the ongoing negotiations of the household, and Silas came in behind him and caught him by the collar before he could get mud on the kitchen floor and redirected him back to the porch to deal with his boots. There was a brief argument that Emmeline didn't look up for, because she had learned which arguments resolved themselves and which ones needed intervention, and this was the former. When Silas came in properly, he came and stood behind her chair and looked over her shoulder at the notebook. Eliza was still talking, listing the things that Emmeline needed to know about spring in Montana, and Emmeline was writing, and Silas read what she was writing and was quiet. Then he reached past her to turn the page a fraction, to see what she had written before, and the warmth of him, and the simple fact of him being there, in that kitchen, in that house, and she thought, I did not come here for this. And then she thought, I came here anyway. He went and got his own coffee. He sat at the table. Theo came back in with clean boots, triumphant. Eliza continued her lesson. Emmeline wrote down everything. Outside the window, the last of the snow was pulling back from the pasture, and the land was brown and then green and then a shade of green that didn't have a name in Cincinnati. And the morning was ordinary and sufficient and hers, and that, she understood now, was what the word home had always been trying to mean.